Hi, I'm Dr. Selena Fisk, and welcome to this episode of Make Data Talk. In this podcast, I help you turn your spreadsheets into stories in a way that is practical, accessible, and hopefully a whole lot more useful than your grade 9 maths textbook. Today, I'm going to be talking about choosing the right visualisations, whether that be in report writing or to use in data stories when we share them with an audience. Not all data viz is created equally, and this episode is going to unpack some of the best choices of visuals for different purposes, and I'm also going to share a couple of design tips for you to keep in mind. I often work in a really interesting space in between people who are analysts and data scientists and people who are designing dashboards and reports, and the people in an organisation for whom those reports are being designed for. And the narrative that I get from both of those groups is often that the people designing the reports and creating the visualizations get frustrated because they feel that the other people are not really using the work that they're doing to its capacity. And the other people in the organization share a lot of frustration because they kind of say the reports or the dashboards or the visuals that they're being given by the data scientists are not meeting their needs. They're not telling them what they actually want to know. This is tricky because often there hasn't been a conversation between those two groups, and there's a lot of assumptions being made from one group to the next. But whether or not this is you or you're an analyst, or you're creating your own visualizations or thinking about using data visualizations to tell a data story to other people, there are certainly some things that are worth thinking about in terms of design and in terms of choosing the visualizations that mean that we're likely to be a bit more successful than we could have been otherwise. The number one thing that we need to keep in mind is the main message that we're trying to convey in the data visualization. So if we're trying to represent a particular gap, if we're trying to look at trends over time, if we're trying to look at, say, different categories, then we need to make data visualization decisions based on that message that we're trying to share and convey. And I guess the problem with some of this sometimes is in, say, for example, in Excel, if you have all of your data sitting in there, Excel will often offer you some recommended charts or suggested ways of visualizing that information. And I guess I'm just here to say in this episode today is about, we need to be more discerning than that. And often Excel gets it wrong. And so what is recommended as the best option for that particular data set may not be the best option because Excel actually doesn't know what you're trying to share or what message you're trying to get across. So the main thing we need to do as the developer or the person, say, asking for this dashboard or having these conversations with our analysts is we need to think about what do we want to be able to convey. And there's lots of different options, and we can choose different visualizations depending on the message and how we would like it portrayed. So, for example, if we want to highlight the gap in different metrics, one of the ways that we could represent a gap, particularly say month-to-month gap, would be by using a waterfall chart. So Excel has waterfall charts available, but a waterfall chart only highlights the difference between values. So the interesting thing about that is that when the user looks at a waterfall chart, the size of the change is really obvious, and it's often color-coded either being a positive or a negative change. And so the user immediately, there's one additional level of thinking that's removed as opposed to kind of putting two bars side to side. When two bars are side to side, the user has to look at it and think, okay, well, the first one's there, the second one's there, what are the values on the side and what's the size of that gap and how significant is it? Whereas if we can just represent the change, that whole level of thinking is kind of taken out. We can see the change immediately. One of the other ways of looking at a gap or a change in data is to use a lollipop chart. So a lollipop chart has often two circles, so a starting data point, and it's a circle at one end and then a circle at the other end for the new metric, and then often a line joining the two. So it's often called a lollipop chart. Sometimes we do want to look at data longitudinally or over time. So when we do that, a line graph is absolutely the best way to represent that information. The thing I would add, I guess, is maybe we need, say, a context line. And so I presented on a data visualization webinar this morning, and it was for the Pacific Data Viz Challenge. and it's hosted in the Pacific. And so there were people from New Caledonia and Fiji and Namibia and kind of all around the world as well. And their focus in the DataVis challenge is on gender equality. So I was kind of saying to them, if you wanted to graph on a line chart, say pay gap, for example, over time between men and women, you could potentially show the country difference, but it would also be useful perhaps to put the global difference in as a yardstick, because when we just have one trend line longitudinally, we don't necessarily know whether that's really good, whether it's bad, whether it's kind of average. And so we need something to provide a bit of context for us. One of the mistakes I often see with bar charts, so bar charts are helpful when we want to compare categories. One of the mistakes I see is bar charts with way too many bars. So I saw a really bad example a few weeks ago of a bar chart that I reckon had about 50 different bars in it. So you can imagine those bars were not very wide, they were very thin, and there were about 10 metrics or so. And it was every metric 1 to 10, and then they were repeated for the second time period, 1 to 10, repeated third time, 1 to 10. And so the first bar in each category was orange. And for me to think about, well, what was happening to that orange category over time, as the user and as the person kind of consuming the information, I had to look at the height of these different bars. I had to jump across all of these other bars to think about the next value. Then I was having to process that gap, which was made harder because there was all these bars in between. And it was really hard to identify those trends and insights, which we're actively trying to do when we're actually engaging in the data analysis. So again, if we're asking for visuals, if we're creating them for other people, if we're creating them for one of our presentations, we've got to think, if that's a category that we would really like people to focus on, how do we just pull out that data and show them just that specific thing, rather than clouding the visualization with all of that additional and potentially unnecessary information. One of the ways that we can show spread, so maybe an average or a median, or a bar chart, for example, might not be the best way to represent something, but perhaps you want to actually show the spread where you've got a particular metric, but across a whole lot of different maybe time periods. It could be, say, retail stores. It could be across different kind of areas in the country, like geographically. There's kind of no really hard and fast rules about it. But when we do spread, one of the best ways to represent spread is a box plot, because a box plot shows your maximum score, it shows the minimum score, it shows the middle score, and it divides all of the different results up into the 25th percentile groups. And so you can see whether there's one area that is really spread out. You can see if there's an area where there are results that are quite similar and they're quite compressed and quite close to one another. So it can be really useful. And again, to provide some context, you could show a box plot, for example, for one retail store over a number of months, but then you could also show, say, for the company, what was happening, on a bigger scale. So you can do a bit of comparison side to side if you want to. If you want to show the elements of a whole, there's kind of two ways of doing this. I know, don't hate me, but pie charts are an option if you want to show elements of a whole. There is a whole section of the population out there who hate pie charts. I understand and I respect you, but that's not my experience. I don't think they're too bad. But in saying that, one of the main stipulations I have is that you need to have 4 or less components on your pie chart. Once we start getting into 5, 6, 7, a pie chart is not for you. You need to think about how you could represent it differently. But if there's 4 or less things, we should absolutely, we could be considering a pie chart. I won't say should, but you could. The other, I guess, non-negotiable for me is that there needs to be the starting point, or the starting line essentially needs to be from the midpoint of the circle straight up to the top, almost like a 12 o'clock line. What that does is it orients the user and their view, and so we can start to make good decisions and judgments about the size of each of the pieces of pie. It becomes really hard when that line is not vertical and it's not coming, like that 12 o'clock hand on a clock. The other way we can show components of a whole is through a stacked bar chart. So stacked bar charts are often better when they're using percentages, so not raw scores. But what they do is they show the components of a whole. Again, we don't want to have a whole lot of different components. It gets really hard to read and interpret when we have too many sections. But it can be a useful way, particularly when we stack the stacked bar charts side by side and we compare different metrics. Can be pretty useful. So they're kind of a couple of the key decisions that we can make when we're looking at, say, representing a gap between metrics, when we're looking at something over time, when we're comparing categories, when we're looking at the spread of information, or we're looking at the things that make up a whole. So a couple of other things that are worth thinking about, and that's around some of those design principles. So one of the things that's really important is to use colour well. And that means being consistent. So I would say if you've got a maximum of, say, 4 or 5 categories, then that should be the maximum number of colours that you're using in your entire report or infographic or dashboard. And we want to be using the same shades, the same hex codes, and we want the colours to be meaning the same things. So if purple is great and really high, then purple needs to be representing that same thing all the way through the dashboard or the report, because it makes it much harder for the user if we flip the colors around and have them mean different things at different times. So we just want to make it as straightforward for them as possible. One of the other things with colour that's worth thinking about is that if you work with people who are colourblind, they're really going to struggle to see the traffic light colour coding system of the red, yellow and green, because they struggle to discern the difference between red and green. So there is actually a colourblind palette. It goes from dark blue as being high down to dark orange being low, with kind of white or grey, light grey in the centre. And so perhaps that could be a strategy for you that you, and there's websites that you can go on to check the accessibility of some of the colours that you use. And I might put them in the show notes so you've got them. But yeah, it's worth thinking about if you work with people who are colourblind, they're going to need a different palette to everybody else. The other thing from a design perspective is that we want to remove a lot of the noise from the visualizations. If it doesn't need to be there, then we need to take it out. So if we don't need the key, if we don't need labels, if we don't need the grid lines, whatever it might be, then we actually need to remove it. It just drops the cognitive load, and it makes the trends and insights easier for the user because they can see it more clearly. And actually on the color piece as well, we can choose to use color really well and deliberately, so rather than Excel, for example, defaults to a different color for each bar, but actually you might only want to highlight one bar and identify, or I guess draw people's attention to that. And so what it means is that you color that particular bar orange and then every other one is gray. So that's a really different aesthetic to every bar being a different color, and then hoping people will focus on that particular thing that you're really interested in. The final piece on this and dashboard, this is for dashboard design and also for writing reports where you've got a lot of visualizations in it. We need to think about dashboard design and we need to think about, I guess, the way that people approach it in the same way that we think about books. So in a dashboard, we read top to bottom and left to right. So your most important visualizations need to be in your top left-hand corner, and then you almost need to drop in importance as you progress through the dashboard and kind of go further down the page. So the most important, impactful visuals at the top, and then we can kind of change that as we move through. Equally in a report, ideally, you'd want to have some of those really impactful visuals early on. You'd want them kind of fronting up the report, and then you can go into further details down the track or in the appendix, for example. But if we want it to be really punchy and have an impact, we want to be choosing great visualizations and putting them up front so the user understands really clearly what's going on, and then they can start thinking about action and what they do with those trends and insights rather than being bogged down in trying to work out what the data is actually telling them. So thank you for joining us on this episode of Make Data Talk this week. If you found this useful, feel free to share it with any of your data nerd mates who are creating their own visualizations or writing reports. Data visualizations are not all created equally, and this is just about having conversations about what works more for us in some occasions than others. And the more people we get proficient and confident in these decisions, the better data visualizations we're going to get around the world is the plan. So thanks so much for being here. And as always, take care and look after yourself.